Welcome to Lupine Genomics number 3. This is an occasional series where I look at the literary techniques and style of Gene Wolfe. Most Gene Wolfe content, not all, but most is focused on the mysteries of his books and the meanings of his books, which are great topics, and so they talk about that. This is me just trying to talk about how he achieved some of this in technical terms. He writes stories, so he has to be using words and sentences. How does he do that? And I think last time, for instance, I did talk about style. I talked about the developing style of Gene Wolfe, and I talked about just some of the ways he uses voices even within the same era or period of writing. This was what we did. This was Lupine. This back in February, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. Looking at a few examples from the Sorcerer's House, from Fifth Head of Cerberus and on Blue's Waters, and even within the same book, looking at style. And this one is about, basically, we're going to call it about defamiliarization, elision, and revelation. These are all posh words. These are $10 words, I know. The point here is going to be to talk about common ways, some of the ways in which Gene Wolfe sets up mysteries or particularly reveals them, both and. Things which, and these are, I'm going to be going for some reasonably famous ones here. How he creates mysterious worlds and how he gives us mysterious situations and how he reveals things to us in that situation. There are many more complex examples than this, and though I will talk about narrators partly, I won't be talking, for instance, about narrative voice and the way in which narrative voice can be a mystery or can be explained internally. I'll give one example, particularly of narrative voice, that's important, but it's a technical thing rather than about the whole narrative thing. We're not talking about unreliable narrators. There's a couple of books I'm thinking about in my head that you could call them amongst his urban or urban fantasy books, which people would say the narrator is lying functionally the whole time. That is a way of setting up a mystery and potentially revealing it through things the narrator says. We'll touch on an example of something like that, but we're not talking about the kind of whole big thing. We're talking about specific set situations, specific technical decisions in terms of structuring revelation or word use, things like that. So defamiliarization is the first, and then elision and revelation is the second. This will have some spoilers for some Wolfe books, specifically on Blue's Waters, Shadow and Claw, Shadow of the Torturer, Claw of the Conciliator, and Peace. I'm making the assumption that either you've read lots of Gene Wolfe or you don't mind if you get some spoilers. These aren't going to be crippling ones, but some of them are significant ones. So let's I just need to switch into draw mode because of the way that OneNote does these things, for whatever reason. Example 1. So defamiliarization. Defamiliarization is a technique most often used by Wolfe in his sci-fi fantasy books, sci-fi books, particularly I'm thinking about the solar cycle. I'm thinking about Book of the New Sun, Book of the Long Sun, Book of the Short Sun, Earth of the New Sun, where often you see something, but it is described or presented to you in a way that is confusing, weird, you don't get it. And then maybe on a reread, or maybe when a later point comes up, or just as you reflect upon it, you realise, this was this all along. This was this all along. And the defamiliarization is not him missing out information. It is him accurately describing things or presenting things in a particular way where the rules are clear, but where the whole experience makes you step back and think, okay, what's going on? What is this? Oh, okay, maybe it's this, or, oh, okay. It kind of presents a challenge of understanding, and which is itself, there's a degree of the ancient theologian Origen thought of the idea that possibly God could be making the sacred text confusing to force his reader to understand. And I think defamiliarization, to make more effort to understand, and defamiliarization, I think, is a technique that pushes the reader in that way. And we actually know he not just does this implicitly, but we know he explicitly does it. And one of our examples will talk about that, where the author talks about defamiliarization functionally. So the first example is from Shadow of the Torturer, and this is a very famous one. Severian is in the library of the Citadel, and there are many things which, in Shadow the Torturer, Book of the New Sun, which are unfamiliar, but as we think more, become familiar. And some of them are really at the meta level. For instance, the fact that Nessus, the city in which most of the action takes place, or much of the action takes place, I should say, and Severian starts, is probably Buenos Aires, and most of the stuff that's happening is in South America, and there's all these clues for this, but this is this high-level stuff. And defamiliarization is working there because of the fact that we're talking about our Earth, but so much has changed that we are just unfamiliar. There's a similar case, and this is relevant here, which is that you look up at the sky and there's a moon in the sky, but the moon is green because it's been terraformed. So there's a similar thing there where even just the kind of basic fact it's on Earth with a moon, these things are defamiliarized to us. By Wolfe in his description. But here is maybe the most famous one, or one of the most famous examples of this. Thus I became acquainted, in the running messages and going to the library, with all the thoroughfares, and with many an unfrequented corner granaries, with lofty bins and demonic cats. Cat there may not be cat. That is itself potentially a defamiliarization. And the Pinakotheken, with their great hallway topped by a vaulted roof of window-pierced brick, floored with flagstones, strewn with carpets, and bound by walls from which dark arches opened to strings of chambers lined, as the hallway itself was, with innumerable pictures. Many of these were so old and smoke-grimed, I could not discern their subjects, and there were others whose meaning I could not guess. A dancer whose wings seemed leeches, a silent-looking woman who gripped a double-bladed dagger and sat beneath a mortuary mask. After I'd walked at least a league among these enigmatic paintings one day, I came upon an old man perched on a high ladder. I wanted to ask my way, but he seemed so absorbed in his work, I hesitated to disturb him. Not the library, this is the curators, rather. The picture he was cleaning showed an armoured figure standing in a desolate landscape. It had no weapon, but held a staff bearing a strange, stiff banner. The visor of the figure's helmet was entirely of gold, without eye slits or ventilation. Nothing like that. In its polished surface, the deathly desert could be seen in reflection and nothing more. Let's just go over things. I'm going to quickly go over things where, in this passage, we could see as examples of defamiliarizing or giving us something. Either defamiliarization is giving us something we think we understand, but we don't, and we begin to realize perhaps we don't. Using something, a word or a concept we don't understand or might not understand to describe something we actually do understand. So itself, it becomes alien to us. I think granaries probably not, but maybe cats. Maybe cats is an unusual thing. Pinakotheken, German word, I believe. Many of these pictures are so old. Okay, then there's these ones. Okay, this wings, a dancer who has wings, a silent-looking woman with a black dagger. I don't know, by the way, if either of these have been identified. I don't remember from my reading and listening if they have. But the point is, it doesn't matter if they haven't been. These are weird pictures, and it's in a Pinakotheken, and there might be cats, but the cats are demonic. Are they actually cats? We'll get back to that. But all these things are potentially things which alienate. And then we get a final picture, which is this. And remember, we've heard of these other two weird pictures, and then we hear of a knight, basically. An armoured figure, has a banner, it doesn't have a weapon, has a reflective visor, and it's in a deathly desert. What a strange figure. Now, here's the spoiler, here's the punchline. This is Neil Armstrong on the moon. The deathly desert, well, it's the blasted rock of the moon. The visor, the gold visor, is the astronaut visor, isn't it? He's in armour, seemingly, in the sense he's fully suited, and to someone in a kind of regressed, semi-high-tech, but somewhat crumbled, semi-medieval world, that would seem like a knight or an armoured figure, a soldier. He's got a flag, the strange stiff banner. It's not a banner Severian recognises. We recognise it, but he doesn't describe it. He doesn't say a strange stiff banner which had a number of stripes and a number of stars and a blue field at the top left-hand corner. He doesn't say that. We don't know what it is. We simply hear there's a strange stiff banner. We simply hear there's an armoured figure. But there's enough stuff there, and this could be seen as more a tease or a little game. But of course, it has a literary effect. Is that here we have, with the big revelation, of it being Neil Armstrong, we suddenly realise this is our world, but everything is so alien. The final thing, by the way, the moon. I mentioned the moon is green. He's described that. That's really weird to us. It defamiliarises us with this thing that we think is familiar, the Earth and the moon, but the moon is green. But Severian is not familiar with the concept, because when he looks at the Deathly Desert, he doesn't connect that with green loon in the sky, which is probably healthier and nicer than the Earth of the new, than the Earth of the old sun. This kind of very decayed place. So all these things are conspiring to half jangle us and half clue us in. There's a few things again. Pinakotheken, I believe, I know it from German gallery names. So we're talking about a gallery, but he doesn't just say "and the gallery" with the great hallway topped by a vaulted roof, window, pierced brick, floor with flagstones. It doesn't say gallery, it says Pinakotheken. There's a choice, and we'll get to this in a second, but we're at the choice of a word which we don't understand and we have to think about. So, yeah, all these things defamiliarize us and force us back, and we have to think again, as I say, like the theologian Origen talks about. Example 2, this does connect, and so does example 3. These are all from New Sun. This is from the translation note to the whole. The nature of the riding and draft animals employed, so Gene Wolfe is translating a book that he's got from the future, is frequently unclear in the original text. I've scrupled to call these creatures horses, since I'm certain the word is not strictly correct. The Destriers of the Book of the New Sun are unquestionably much swifter, more enduring animals than those we know, and the speed of those used for military purposes seems to permit the delivering of cavalry charges against enemies supported by high enemy armament. Latin is once or twice employed to indicate that inscriptions and the like are in a language Severian appears to consider obsolete. What the actual language may have been, I cannot say. So the Latin one is maybe more questionable as to its exact effect, but Destriers, here's an interesting one. Wolfe, the translator, the fake translator, does not want to use the word horses because it's not strictly correct. Maybe. Destriers, well, that's a war horse. He calls them that because they're these war mounts, but they are swifter and more enduring. In fact, they're six-legged as well. They're either hybrids or they're alien animals. And so we are told up front, essentially that the words we read will not always mean what we think they mean. So we've got some things, as we go back up to example 1. Why has he used a German word to translate in galleries? Don't know. Latin is used to show an ancient language, but the Latin then could be ironically, could be actual Latin, or it could be English. English to Severian will be translated as Latin. That is maybe, as I say, less defamiliarizing, but it's again the fact that this world and the techniques that, in this case, Wolfe is explicitly saying he uses, he is showing you half the magician's trick up front, are going to be ones which make you think you understand something, but you don't. And even the translator admits that. They're kind of like a horse, they're kind of not. Don't know what to do. And this connects to number 3. This, by the way, is why I say the cats may not be cats. Who knows? Example 3. This is the last one in this little subsection. 5 riders sat Destriers whose hooked tushes were encrusted with lazulite. The men wore helmets and capes of indanthrine blue and carried lances whose heads ran with blue fire. Their faces were more akin than the faces of brothers. On these riders, the tide of travellers broke as a wave on a rock, some turning left, some right. Dorcas was torn from my arm. I drew terminus est to cut down those between us, and found I was about to strike Master Malrubius, who stood calmly, my dog Triscally at his side, and in the midst of the tumult. Seeing him so, I knew I dreamed, and from that knew, even while I slept, the visions I had had of him before had not been dreams. So, there are actually a few of these techniques, not all of which we're touching today, where Wolfe sets up mysteries or gives information. So he has a dream which is relating to events at the end of Shadow of the Torturer, and he relives them in a particular way, in a way that's perhaps more confusing again, and then he sees the ghost of an old teacher, who may well be someone who Wolfe writes about many, over a decade later as well, and from seeing Malrubius in it, so there's already a thing there of there's another technique of setting up a mystery that you don't understand while also giving you information that you kind of understand that seems to reveal it. But anyway, defamiliarization. Well, Destriers, again, they've got tusks. That's what I take tushes to be, tushes. Encrusted with lazulite. Unusual word choice, much like Destrier, much like Panarchatecan. Indanthrine blue. That's so not cerulean or navy or another shade of blue we might know easily. We have to go to the dictionary. Well, so here we have the defamiliarization of word choice, and we have the defamiliarization of. Imagine, I mean, this is of course Wolfe the translator has put his tongue in his cheek / showed us half the magic trick here for this. 5 riders sat horses, whose curving tusks were encrusted with blue gems. Say, that's, you could read that. Except actually, 5 riders sat 6-legged alien mounts, whose curved tusks were encrusted with blue gems. Which is which? Destrius actually collapses the difference in a way that unsettles us. The lances ran with blue fire. Are they actually on fire? Do they appear to be on fire? Presumably we're talking about actually, and go back to example 2 for a point in this, it's an energy weapon. Their lances are shock weapons. Whether they're ranged or not, we later get a variety of confusing energy weapons. And again, the way that, that's a 4th example, if you want an easy one, is is it Lictor? Or is it Autarch? Lictor, Sword or Citadel. Severian is on the battlefield versus the Askians, and he sees all these weapons that people use in these different regiments. There's different things people have, and that's a case of defamiliarization, because there's so many things there where we're kind of like, I half understand that, but actually the way he's describing it, because it's familiar to him, is not familiar to me. In the same way that some things that would be familiar to us, like Neil Armstrong, are not familiar to Severian. Yes, so, and their faces are more akin than the face of brothers. There's a separate thing there, just in terms of, I'm not sure if vagueness is an official technique of Wolfe. It is. He often uses vague and imprecise language very precisely and very carefully. Are these guys clones or not? Are we talking about people who have masks on their helmets? Who knows? Like as in they have visors, but whatever. Here we have examples separate from these kind of other sets of just about the Destrier, but also to do with things that these soldiers have of word choice, Destrier, tushes, lazulite, indanthrine, and we have depiction, like we don't, which connects to that. We don't know what the Destrier exactly looks like, and we learn, it's a 6-legged alien or hybrid animal, but also what this weapon is. It's probably an energy weapon. Again, we use what we're finding is that words we either think we know do not seem to mean what we immediately assume they mean, and words we don't know relate to things that are probably easier for us to understand. Ironically, Phylogene, another example, very dark, very black, very dark black. The point is that this is a repeated thing. You get the idea. Defamiliarization, which actually goes 2 ways. The familiar word used to represent an or concept to describe an unfamiliar thing, and the unfamiliar description, possibly due to Severian's own inexperience with it, as with he sees green loon, so he describes a green planet and we don't understand it, or he describes a painting he doesn't understand, but we, as we reflect upon it, might. Defamiliarization. This is a technique that both sets up and reveals mysteries. We know how far ahead in the future this must be for things to be certain ways. The second technique I want to talk about today is elision and revelation. So the idea that Wolfe, elision is not quite vagueness. They overlap. Vagueness is, I think, when Wolfe uses one term that can mean multiple things, or he describes a scene in a way that is not quite missing out information, but where things are open to, Severian's experience with Gelenta actually is a good example of that. Controversially, but I think it probably is that you're presented with all the information you might need, but there do seem to be a couple of strongly held views on it. Elision and revelation, said, is where Wolfe misses out information. He either never mentions it, or he hints at it in particular ways, or he gradually reveals more, but he doesn't reveal more by saying, so for instance, let's say in an Agatha Christie book, There are discoveries. We found the evidence. And the evidence actually might mean something that you, the reader, usually often means something you don't realise. Oh, what does this handkerchief mean? What a weird piece of evidence. But the point is, all the things are meant to be put out on the table in front of you. Whereas with Wolfe, in the same way, even when he's revealing things, he's often doing it via eliding vital context, vital information. There's not enough information being offered to you to often, on a first glance, process what's even happened. Whereas in a Christie, at least, the evidence is all on the table. It's just you do not understand how it fits together. So I've got two examples of this. One of it is to do with just major plot point, and we'll talk about peace there. The second is to do with a narrator and Wolfe's trick of changing or warping or confusing narrators. And we're not talking about narrative voice here, but we're talking about particularly the way in which Wolfe reveals a major mystery, essentially offhand, in a way that, in a sense, is quite obvious. So, but it's something where, even in the scene in which he's revealing it, he is not giving you functionally, the upfront information that you would think was fair game. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, the first example. This is, I've actually taken this. This is from Peace, which is a wonderful mystery/ghost story, I think. So this is basically Alden Weir. There's a bunch of weird things that go on in his life, and he's always like, "Oh yeah, this weird thing happened." Oh, anyway, there's questions about who he is and what's happening with what he's saying. What is he talking about? When is he talking about? There's dashing around in time. At points it's not clear who he's talking to when narrating. But there is in the, I think is it in chapter 3? I didn't note it down. But in the back, in the third quarter more or less of the book, he is talking about a variety of things, but particularly it is a fairly concentrated narrative section, fairly close together, lots of information about finding out about potential treasure. He gets a book from a news bookshop. It seems to point towards treasure near where they are. Is it 40,000 gold dollars buried by Quantrill the Partisan, something like that? And the events to do with his investigation into this with a lady he knows and has some sort of romantic relationship with, Lois Arbuthnot, the librarian. And in terms of when they go to Gold's, the bookshop, we have a scene when I've selectively quoted. He says, "This is Alden, the narrator," because he's narrating all this. I nodded to the thing and said, "The shops had been here when I was a boy." And then there's a bit of description, and then it says, "While I talked, my mind had been filling with images of," sorry, that's a type on my part, "with images of my Aunt Olivia, my aunt soaked in a hot tub." And then he essentially has an erotic vision of his aunt. And then he says, "Oh, you must excuse me, to start the next session, I can write nothing more about the trip Lois and I made to Gold's, or our search for the buried treasure." So there is something here where he refuses to tell us what even happened with this very important story that's part of what he's saying, and he immediately connects it to something else. There is something but he doesn't give us the key information about his aunt, and this is a thing that comes up repeatedly. So there is a thing where he elides, he refuses to tell you either about what happened on the trip to Gold's, really, or the context of this event with his aunt, where he's seeing her in a hot tub when his parents are away, and which is never really in the text, and this is quite intentional, adequately explained. There's a few things to do with that. Elision, but also revelation, because you're realising at least there's something odd with his aunt, and also that he's connecting this other woman to his aunt. He returns to the narrative later. Lois says she's not going to dig the graves before falling asleep, and Alden goes home. They kind of have a bit of a date. She gets drunk and falls asleep, basically, and has said, "Oh, I'm not going to dig." Alden again connects Lois to his aunt, and then compares their sex lives. Again, this is something where we actually haven't been given direct context really for why he is constantly thinking about his aunt's sex life. But again, there's other things going on. But again, we then realise the next day that he hasn't told us everything within that scene, nor has Lois. The next day, Lois rings Alden. Alden reveals he's got a pick and shovel behind the refrigerator. Lois wants to dig for the treasure without Alden, seemingly. But they then, obviously, he doesn't explain how, but they obviously agree to meet. They discuss the treasure's location and they set out to dig together, right? So you've got a thing where, and this is slightly noirish almost, isn't it? But the fact that he has in the previous scene not said, I saw the pick and shovel behind her fridge. That's elided there, even though it's impressed itself upon him. And when he is thinking later that night, he does not think about the fact that Lois wants to dig the treasure alone, but instead thinks about her sex life, about their potential romantic relationship. They then go together. But the next section is Alden returning to the bookshop. We actually functionally have a time leap here. It turns out to confront Gold about the fact the treasure wasn't there. Basically because Gold is forges his antique books. You're always welcome. Perhaps you'll bring Miss Arbuthnot next time. I'm afraid we won't be seeing her again. She's moved away. A bit later, Miss Arbuthnot and I had a disagreement while we were looking for the treasure, and it started me thinking. A bit later, I left him sitting and went back to my apartment. It was Saturday again. Lois had gone out of my life. I should have said she had left my future. I could never eradicate her from my past, no matter how hard I tried. Which is oddly hot for something where not much has apparently happened with Lois, other than these weird romantic connections between Lois and his aunt. We actually are going to get the impression from this, strong impression, that something happened. Lois isn't coming back. This is, very soon afterwards. And Lois isn't coming back. In fact, they had a disagreement, and something happened, or so something about Lois is important enough that though she is no longer part of his future, she'll never be able to be eradicated from his past. We then get, and this is itself a separately revealing thing, Mr. Gold's 16-year-old daughter comes and basically sexually bribes Alden not to reveal her father as a fraudster. And this seems important because it reveals that Alden is a man of, the narrator here is a man of poor character, let's say. And then while they're talking about this, Alden remembers digging with Lois. My shovel bit struck a stone, causing the blade to ring, and in a spot of moonlight I had seen the glint of metal in Lois's hand. I'd taken it from her a little. I'd taken it from her, a little nickeled 25 caliber Colt automatic, when she bent down to see what I had found. She had said she was afraid I would try to keep everything for herself. She had been afraid. I've slightly garbled that, but you get the picture. Then Sherry finds the 25 under his pillow, which he's had for a couple of weeks and intends to dispose of soon. So actually, this though we never hear the obvious, this seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? He's murdered Lois over the treasure that's not there. It's not really clear. And he has kept the gun, and then Sherry finds it. And actually, this feels at least, and appearances can be describing, or the one's first feeling about it can be confusing and deceiving. Sorry, but the point is that this is fairly easy to put together, and yet even this fairly easy Wolfian mystery is not presented as here's a set of clues that you just have to think about. How do you connect the scarf and the strange footsteps? Or whatever. It's similar in many. I've got my mystery books to my left here. Most mystery books like that set it up like that. Father Brown or Cadfael, or Agatha Christie, or even with a much more gimmicky structure, Sherlock Holmes. There's a bunch of weird bits of evidence that we know are evidence, and then Holmes connects in a brilliant manner. Actually, we are not given a straightforward set of pieces of evidence. We're repeatedly not given information that turns out to be vital in the very next section. Like, for instance, he refuses to tell us about stuff because instead he's had a weird emotional experience by his aunt. That's not explained. We don't find, in fact, that kind of stuff with his aunt is never fully explained explicitly in the text. Or again, the fact that when he goes over to her house, he sees stuff, and that would seem because he's describing the experience of going over. He never says, "Oh, I saw these tools." We only hear it via dialogue to Lois, revealing that there is some sort of tension over the treasure. And then Lois is gone, and so we begin to suspect the worst. And at this point, we probably know what's happened, but we don't know exactly how it happened. We then get a separate sidelight on Alden's character, and then we find out about this gun. But if there is a shot fired, we never hear about it. We just know that Lois is gone. But of course, maybe more important than the fact that this fits into what seems to be a string of killings by Alden, is how, though that is a very important point, is how this reflects, how this is part of how Alden reflects on his relationship with his aunt, this kind of seminal figure in the book. So elision and revelation. Often it's precisely via an elision, via the thing he refuses to say, that you begin to think about other things to do with Alden. Well, if he's not telling me about having murdered Lois, what else isn't he telling me? What other people who disappear from the narrative is he not telling me about? The second example, last for today, this is long. I may skip over sections. This is the final page of the final chapter of On Blues Waters, first book of the Short Sum. Basically, so Book of the Short Sum is narrated by a character called Horn. He says, "I'm writing this." But there are peculiar things that go on with the voice of the narrator, and the switch in narrative voice. By the way, this is something that happens in different ways at different times in several Wolfe books. There is, for instance, and I give these as some of these are more high-level, complex speculation, and some of them are certified and sure. But say Peace, there's some question about what has happened to Alden and the stuff to do with Missy Reads, is what voice and how is that voice influenced by different things that have happened that is narrating. Book of the New Sun, there is an issue of like when Severian narrates, and he's the narrator of the whole book, and he is the main character. How far are other voices via Al-Zabo speaking through him? How far are they in fact confusing things he says? So narrative voice again matters. Fifth head of Cerberus, the third novella there, VRT, which kind of ties up a lot of the timeline of that story. VRT, you have what seems to be a narrative shift halfway through that you can piece together. It feels like one of Wolfe's easier mysteries, but it's something where again that happens. And Short Sun is like that in the way that, by that I mean, it seems to be a narrative shift, but it's confusing. It's not clear what's happened exactly. And an important thing is, we don't even know if there is a point at which, it's uncertain which point the narrative voice shifts between whoever or whatever is exactly writing the start of this story and who's doing it later. But this is the thing, is that Wolfe has given no explicit clue and said, oh, by the way, this happened, and then potentially the narrator has changed either in terms of how they feel or how they think, or in some other mysterious way. At the end, I've reread most of this, not all but most. There are many things I ought to have written less about, a few about which I should have written more. Harry Mau's smile, how it lights his face, how cheerful he is when everything is bad and getting worse. Nothing about the first days of the war before I was wounded, or not nearly enough. Nothing about my dream of an angry and vindictive Skiller who talked like Oreb. Nothing about the fight in the Lander, how horrible it was. The Inhumane had barricaded themselves in the nose. Crate and the rest we had to fight the ones who still believed, half a dozen. They were brave. They're brave, certainly. They're extremely brave, fought with as much courage and determination as any men I have ever seen. They died thinking their way back onto the wall, and to this moment I envied them that. We go on. This should have happened. They should have made me feel younger. This is the last sheet. In fact, it's not. He writes 2 more books. He gets more paper. Saw my own reflections, Stanley. So what we say here in terms of this issue of elision and revelation is, here the narrator describes the fact that lots of things have been elided. Lots of things, or things that should have been mentioned were not mentioned, things that have been mentioned things that haven't really been described, or what he hasn't described himself feeling how he should have. So here there is that separate thing I mentioned of almost a vagueness. We may feel, and this will connect to a different time we'll talk about narrative voice, we may feel there's a different voice going on here. Our opening narrator might not have said something like Harry Mau's smile, how it lights his face, how cheerful he is when everything is bad and getting worse, and things like that. Would the person who does the very first bits of narration have said that? Who knows? But is there a voice change? But that's not what we're talking about exactly. But we start to get the sense that is he unhappy because he's not written well enough, or is he unhappy because there's something more deeply wrong with the narrative in his view? And this is the end. He doesn't have any more paper, but he will write there are important events that happened. Okay, fair enough. We already have this issue of Elision, and again, Wolfe is maybe putting out half the magician's trick. But then we get, then he says, I saw my own reflection standing in the water holding up my spear, wild white hair, an empty socket, lined and worried old face. Okay, well that's odd because that wild white hair, when did he have white hair? This, early middle-aged man who I don't think has white hair at the start. Maybe, maybe I don't know, who knows? It's no small thing to have a woman as beautiful as Chandy, so she loves you. I'm old now, and she must leave you, he says, but a fairer maid I ne'er did see. So this guy quotes poem on this. I hope the Hanny's girl gets home. Little space left. I am ashamed of many things I have done, but not of how I have lived my lives. Lives? I snatched the ball and won the game. I should have been more careful, but what if I had been? What then? Okay, the key thing here is you've got all these weird bits going on where you're like, okay, it's weird that he's saying, by the way, I haven't told you loads of stuff. Isn't it weird I haven't told you loads of stuff? Okay, there's been things about the voice maybe that we've picked up on. And then suddenly he says, I'm not ashamed of how I live my lives. Okay, that's a weird thing to say. Multiple lives. What's going on here? I've obviously missed something. And then he says, I snatched the ball and won the game. Horn never did that. In fact, Patera Silk did at the very start of Book of the Long Sun, Knights of the Long Sun, in his Christophany, as he is dunking on Horn, because Horn is using his superior skill and size, he's older and bigger, to dunk on the small kids, and Silk, as their youth worker and priest, bashes in, gets the ball and dunks on Horn when they're playing basketball. This is Silk. And we're told in the last paragraph of the book that much of what we've heard before is at least partly from the perspective of Patera Silk. But how? That this is stuff that you can pick apart and find, or the same with the appearance. The fact he suddenly looks different, and this comes up later that people like you don't look like Horn. We're told right at the very end that we have been, in a sense, being tricked, and the evidence is there for us to see with narrative voice changing and with events that happen that are very strange. But it is exactly via him not having mentioned how the narrator looks for the back half of the book. For instance, no one describes him. It's Elision. But it's Elision in terms of what things he chooses not to say, and Wolfe is good enough to tip us off to that at the end. And then it's revelation, the fact that, but the revelation itself is not a, by the way, did you know I'm Patera Silk? It is the indirect thing that we are suddenly, if we are not familiar or if we're not tight on this, we may not even pick it up the first time we read it. That this figure doesn't look like Horn, and is referring to an event which should be in your mind, but will basically not be, because our memories are, unlike Severian's, imperfect, harking all the way back 5 books earlier in your reading to a central event which says that something has happened. So yes, revelation through Elision as the means of revelation. So that's just a couple of ways that Wolfe regularly, I think, messes around with us, but in a way that is not about tricking us. I mean, sometimes there are tricks, but really all of these are examples where he shows us the trick, where he points us to the trick, and where the silences themselves are illuminating and give us more than enough information to work towards the next step on. Anyway, that's that for today. If you've got any thoughts on that, any other examples, any disagreements, any similar ones. So as I say, let's narrow our discussion to where Wolfe is using kind of language choice and information kind of transmission, as in the fact he has control over it and you, the reader, do not, to set up and then reveal and resolve mysteries. Anyway, till next time.